Funding for this program has been provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tonight, a public affairs special from Manchester, New Hampshire. Election 80, the Republican Presidential Candidate Forum. Here is correspondent Kathleen Campion.
Good evening. Next Tuesday, the people of New Hampshire go to the polls to vote in the nation's first state presidential primary in the 1980 election year. Tonight, 7 Republican candidates for the presidential nomination are at the Practical Arts Auditorium in Manchester, New Hampshire. In just a few moments, they'll begin what is being billed as the Republican Presidential Candidates Forum, sponsored by the League of Women Voters. Tonight's debate will have 3 sections. Questions will be asked by a panel of journalists and then by members of the audience. After that, each candidate will be allowed a 1-minute closing statement. The panel consists of the Washington Star's Eileen Shanahan, syndicated political columnist Joseph Kraft, and tonight's moderator, Howard K. Smith.
Public with nonpartisan election information about issues and about candidates. Tonight, here in Manchester, New Hampshire, we proudly continue in that tradition by presenting the first in our series of 1980 presidential forums. Our moderator and chief panelist is that distinguished television correspondent, Mr. Howard K. Smith.
Thank you, Mrs. Heinerfeld, and good evening. The League of Women Voters is pleased to welcome 7 candidates for the Republican presidential nomination. The candidates are seated on the stage in a sequence that has been determined by a random draw. They are, from your left to your right, Congressman John Anderson of Illinois, former Governor John Connally of Texas, Congressman Philip Crane of Illinois, former Congressman George Bush of Texas, United States Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, Robert Dole, the senior U.S. Senator from Kansas, former Governor Ronald Reagan of California. Joining me in questioning the candidates tonight are 2 distinguished journalists. On my right, Eileen Shanahan, the senior assistant managing editor of the Washington Star, and on my left and your right, Joseph Kraft, the nationally syndicated columnist. The first part of tonight's program will consist of questions from this panel to the candidates. In the first part of the forum, the candidate to whom a question is addressed will have 2 minutes to respond. The other 6 candidates will then each have 1 minute to comment or to react in any way. Later in the forum, the candidates will answer questions from the audience. We would like to ask the auditorium audience not to applaud or to react in any way to questions or to answers or to comments. We would like to note also that the same forum opportunities have been offered to the candidates for the Democratic Party's nomination, but so far they have not seen fit to accept. And I would like to ask these candidates who are present if any questions sound hostile, they are not. They are meant to provoke responses we think the public needs to hear.
The first question, I believe, is my own to Congressman John Anderson of Illinois. Congressman Anderson, most Republicans now want us to be firm in dealing with the Russians, yet in Des Moines, all the candidates but you have opposed cutting off grain to Russia. You join the others in opposing consideration of a draft, and you especially have opposed defense spending increases. How can we impress the Russians with our firmness when candidates for the presidency adopt attitudes like those?
Well, first of all, Mr. Smith, on the question of defense spending, of course, I have consistently supported the pledge that was made by the President at the Bonn Conference in 1978 that there be a 3% increase in real terms. It was when, I think in an effort to secure votes in the Senate for SALT II, that he began to talk in terms of percentages of 5 and 5.5% without relating those to what I conceive to be really rational programs adding to the defense of the country, that I drew the line. But to answer the broader part of your question, I think it is important that we use the kind of economic countermeasures, the cutoff of sales of grain, of high technology, that we stop our participation in the Olympics, to notify the Soviet Union of our intention to resist any further adventurism on their part. There's another part of the equation, though, that I think is terribly important, and that is that we demonstrate a capacity to deal with our problems here at home. I firmly believe that there is a certain inner strength of America that has to come to the fore in times like these. These are times piled high with difficulty, And if you read the President's economic report, the #1 problem confronting the nation is not Southwest Asia, even though he once described that as the most dangerous crisis since World War II. He said that it was inflation that was the nation's #1 problem. Now, to be sure, that was a domestic report on the economy. But I think to the extent that we do not deal effectively with inflation, with lagging productivity, and all of these other problems that make up this whole complex of an economy that today I think is performing far worse than it was 3 years ago when Mr. Carter took office. To the extent that we do not deal with those problems, I think we undermine the real strength, the real security of this country.
Governor Connolly, any comment or reaction?
Well, first, I think the Russians are going to be impressed by things that they treasure, and that's strength. And until we're prepared to rebuild the military strength of this country, I don't think we're going to impress them very much with anything. I certainly think we should use whatever leverage we have, economic leverage we have, to try to bring the Russians to their senses. I think we should use whatever influence we have in the world to turn the world against the Russians when they move in an aggressive manner as they have against Afghanistan. But the thing that's going to be most impressive to the Russians is whether or not we restore some of the support for military capabilities in this country, which we permitted to deteriorate over the years. 1970, 7.4% of our GNP went to the military. Last year, 4.5%. That's not going to impress the Russians, and it won't impress them next time. And I think we have no choice but to make a very, very substantial increase in military appropriations for this nation.
Mr. Crane.
A syndicated columnist, Charlie Reese, recently observed that we shouldn't be unduly apprehensive about the Soviets taking over Middle Eastern oil because obviously there's more than they can use, so presumably they would sell the surplus to us. And if you don't believe that, then there are some logical questions we ought to ask ourselves about defense. And that is, why is it that we're building truck plants for the Soviet Union? Why do we give them sophisticated ball bearing technology? Why did we give them computer technology? Why are we giving them wide-body jet technology? And so forth. We've got a schizophrenic policy in effect, and I think it jeopardizes our national security interest. If you're going to embargo grain, for goodness sakes, let's embargo everything against the Soviets as a means of driving a lesson home to them. And I think we should keep in mind that George Washington gave us the soundest counsel, and it's been counsel handed down since the ancient Greeks, that those who desire peace should prepare for war. And this nation better rebuild its defense capability so as to guarantee the security of the United States and peace and freedom worldwide.
Mr. Bush.
Well, I believe that we should strengthen our defense. I believe that the Soviet Union at this time doesn't want war. I think they're confused by our president. I think they saw him fulfilling a campaign pledge about too many generals, too much defense, coming in, cutting way back on the forward budget, and then waking up 3 years into his presidency and saying, hey, we can't trust the Soviet Union. My feeling is we need to restore many of the cuts that he made, add carefully to them, and I believe that strength will deter Soviet aggression. Keep this country strong, and we can have 2 decades of peace.
Senator Baker?
Mr. Smith, I don't think the Russians are confused. I think they have the idea that they've had since World War II, and that is that Uncle Sam's a patsy. And I think that the recent actions by President Carter in cutting the B-1 bomber and delaying the development of the MX missile, by reducing by 50% the size of the commitment to a modern American Navy, that they have the impression that we're flirting with some sort of unilateral disarmament. It is my opinion that if we're going to prosper in this world, we've got to do what Teddy Roosevelt said, walk softly and carry a big stick. But President Carter's cut most of that stick in 2. And it's time that we focused on weapon systems and not just a percentage increase in the defense budget. And that's what I would propose to do.
Senator Dole.
Well, I think, first of all, we must recognize that these were symbolic acts. I haven't seen any Soviets leave Afghanistan since all this was announced in December. I think beyond that, we need to be very realistic. Since January of 1977, up until January of 1980, we've we've reduced the so-called forward budgets by about $60 billion insofar as defense is concerned. It seems to me the obligation is very clear. The American people demand it, the Congress will do it, and I just believe the Republicans have an opportunity. This is our opportunity. President Carter has fiddled it away. And despite all the talk about more defense spending, we've got to keep our eye on one other thing, and that's a meaningful arms limitation agreement. We've got to continue talking to the Soviets because the thought of nuclear war itself is unthinkable.
Governor Reagan.
Abraham Lincoln once said, those who criticize must have the heart to help. And I think that the Republican Party has now found the moment when they must come to the aid of this country. I agree with much of what has been said here. I myself disapproved of the embargo on grain, not because I don't think we should embargo the Soviet Union, keep things from them that will be of help to them, but because it was a kind of a symbol, and I think it was for domestic consumption. It actually hurt the American farmer more than it hurt the Soviet Union. And I believe that just stating a figure for armament is not the answer to our problem. We've got to send some signals to the Soviet Union that there could be a confrontation down the road if they continue. And one of those, I would think, could be building what has to be built in weaponry to once again be in a position where the Soviet Union would not dare lift a hand against the United States.
Thank you, gentlemen. The second question from Ms. Shanahan to Governor Connolly.
Mr. Connolly, many well-informed people in this country believe that what we are actually going to face next from the Russians in the Middle East and Asia is not a clear-cut invasion, but rather a program of systematic infiltration, subversion, attempt at toppling some of the shaky governments in that area, Iran, Pakistan, maybe Saudi Arabia. How would you as president deal with that threat? Will the increased military spending you're talking about really deal with that?
I think actually that might well be the way the Soviets move. They clearly indicated that they were going to move in the Middle East in April of 1978 when they installed Mohammad Taraki as the first puppet head of the Afghan government. I think Afghanistan is a way station on their way and their march to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. I think they have their people in Iran right today. I have always thought that Ghatsadeh was probably a KGB agent. If not, he was at least a Marxist. I think they clearly had a hand, and some of the South Yemenites who went into the city of Mecca and caused the disturbance and occupied the holy shrine there for 2 weeks. I think they're clearly stirring up trouble all over the Middle East. I think we have to do two things. I recommended this on October the 11th of last year, a month before our embassy was occupied in Tehran. I think we have to establish a very strong military presence in the Middle East. I think we need a permanent navy, hopefully in the island of Al-Masira off the coast of Oman to guard the Straits of Hormuz. I think we need to put major components of the Air Force in the Middle East and the Sinai or other fields in the Middle East so that we have a capacity to provide the military stability and the security for all of the Middle East. In addition to that, I think we need to forge a new alliance in the Middle East with Israel, the moderate Arab states, Japan, the countries of Western Europe who have a vital interest, as vital as our own, as well as the United States being a party to that alliance. I don't think there's any question, but what that is the most vital, the most volatile, and the most vulnerable part of the world today, and I think we have to use every resource we have to try to bring about the stability of that region, or the deterioration is going to be disastrous for us.
Thank you, Governor. Mr. Crane, do you have a comment?
Yes, I think the first thing the United States must reestablish is its credibility as a reliable and trustworthy ally. The fact of the matter is, during this Carter administration, we have betrayed friends, whether you refer to Taiwan, where the president unilaterally broke a solemn treaty commitment and sent a telegraphed message to every small country that was an ally of the United States at that time, to pulling the rug out from under the Shah. And I'm not making any brief in defense of the Shah, but I'll tell you the world is a vastly more dangerous place, and there's a greater risk of an international confrontation because the Shah is gone than when the Shah was in control and providing a buffer against Soviet penetration, providing oil to the United States and to Israel during the Middle Eastern conflicts, and simultaneously guaranteeing us vital, critically important listening posts on the Soviet border. I think in addition to that, we should develop a third fleet to patrol the Indian Ocean so we can maintain a strong and powerful presence in the area.
Mr. Bush.
Well, my view is that short range, we should be supporting Pakistan. We should be working with China. China looks at this as a part of an encirclement of them. I look at it as though the Soviet Union, with an energy shortfall in the 80s, is trying to get down to the oil fields. But I think the bottom line is this: you do not build a foreign policy on broken commitments or on vacillation. And so we have to turn it around, not short run, but longer run, so that opposition forces, particularly the Soviet Union, knows we're going to keep our word. And that means we're going to have to strengthen militarily. It means we're going to have to go with the concept of a three-ocean navy. I don't favor permanent basing of U.S. forces in the Middle East. I do favor utilization of ports that have been offered for reasons of projecting, if necessary, U.S. force.
Senator Baker.
Ms. Shanahan, I think it's entirely possible that we'll see Soviet infiltration in that region following on after Afghanistan. But I think there may be a greater danger, really, and that is the possibility that you're going to see a Soviet peace offensive this spring and this summer, and that America may once again be lulled into a false sense of security, and many may look back and say, well, you know, it really wasn't as bad as we thought, so let's abandon all those commitments we made to a stronger Navy and a stronger Air Force and the like. That is the danger I perceive. I hope that we will remember today that the Soviets have always oscillated between offensive thrusts and retreat into a peace offensive. I think that we've got to show a foreign policy and a national defense commitment that is characterized by constancy. I think the Carter administration has shown that they flip-flop on foreign policy, and I think that they have led us into a position where the Russians believe they can push on Uncle Sam and he'll never push back.
Mr. Dole.
Well, first, I think our foreign policy must be bipartisan. We take a look at the past few years, we find about 12 countries who are now sort of alienated from the West. They're tilted toward the Soviets. We find Cuban proxy forces in 4 other countries. We find 3 countries solidly in the Russian camp in the past 3 to 4 years. We're talking about countries with men under arms, 2.5 million or more. So it poses a real threat. I believe we ought to have a presence in Pakistan. We ought to draw the line, say this is as far as you go. And it ought to be done on a bipartisan basis. We haven't had a bipartisan foreign policy in this country for a number of years. It's in our interest. It's in the interest of the people of New Hampshire, in my state of Kansas. You know, the stakes are very high. And whoever is elected in January has that responsibility, and we can meet it as Republicans.
Mr. Reagan.
Well, I believe that one of the first things this country has to do, if we are to preserve freedom and our leadership of the free world, is to have a grand strategy, a plan for the decade of the 80s and for beyond that serves our interest and that gives us contingency plans when things like Afghanistan happen. The president destroyed our credibility to a great extent when he told the Soviet Union, with their troops massed on the Afghanistan border, that we would take serious notice and there would be serious consequences if they crossed into Afghanistan. Well, they crossed into Afghanistan, and we haven't done anything about it, frankly, because we didn't have the means to do anything about it. My own belief is that in addition to showing the flag there in the Middle East,
to indicate that they might face a confrontation with us, we should have in a plan, and I don't say this option is based on or is the only one, but we should have a plan of touching them on soft spots. As, for example, the suggestion I've made about blockading Cuba.
Governor, your time's up, I'm afraid.
I just stopped.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Smith, if indeed we have to fear further penetration and infiltration by the Soviets of Saudi Arabia and Iran, we ought to first stop and think why it is. Why has that become such an attractive target? It is because of our dependence on oil coming from the Persian Gulf, 1.7 million barrels a day. If we want to reduce tensions, therefore, it seems to me logically we ought to first address that problem and try to reduce our dependence. Then secondly, that would make it much easier for us to secure the cooperation of the Japanese, of the West Germans, of the French, of the other nations in the Western world and Japan that also have a vital interest in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. We ought to be busy working with them right now to create the network of collective security arrangements that would be needed to present a united front to show some solidarity against any further Soviet expansion.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now for the next question from Mr. Kraft to Congressman Crane.
Mr. Crane, you're known as the conservatives' conservative, and you've talked extensively on such issues as gun control and abortion and prayer in schools. Why do you think voters should choose a president on those relatively narrow issues rather than on such major matters as inflation, energy, and foreign policy?
Well, first of all, those have not been the issues that I have focused disproportionate attention on. Rather, they are part of a package in an attempt to restore an emphasis on some very traditional and basic values. I have, as a matter of fact, campaigned first and foremost on the issue of inflation from the very first time I ran for Congress in '69 right down to the present day, because it is still the overriding issue which, if left unresolved, will lead to the destruction of our economy, and if that occurs, God forbid, the potential destruction of our political institutions as well. But I think those other issues are important moral values that provide the underpinnings that guarantees the survival of a humane and free and compassionate society, and I have indeed put stress on them. But I have not been the only one who's put stress on them. As you know, Governor Ed King defeated Michael Dukakis, who had impeccable liberal credentials in the neighboring state of Massachusetts on precisely those issues. And Massachusetts, the only state that went for George McGovern in 1972, is a state that has most recently restored prayer in the schools. It's a state also that has a very strong feeling that was manifested in that gubernatorial election on such questions as abortion. And it is a state that is right now seeking to restore capital punishment. I think those are issues that are troubling many Americans, and I think we must focus attention on those just as surely as we concentrate on the question of getting our economy back onto a sound, robust growth track, just as we concentrate simultaneously on beefing up our defense capability to guarantee the security of the United States, and just as we once more assume responsibility for providing critically important leadership during these troubled times to promote our ideals of peace and freedom worldwide.
Mr. Bush, do you have a comment?
Well, my comment is it's understandable that there's great interest in these issues. We're all speaking out on them. People say we haven't taken position on issues. Here's issue papers, not on these particular subjects, although we have shorter ones on those. But it seems to me that people are looking for something, not a single issue candidate. They're looking for something more reasonable, looking for strong leadership in the 80s. The big issues are inflation, energy, and the restoration of respect for this country around the world. And yes, it's appropriate. People ask questions on these single issues. But those issues aren't the issues that are going to decide who is elected President of the United States to lead this country for 8 years in the 80s.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Kraft, I think I understand why those issues are important, because that's sort of the stuff that presidential campaigns are made out of. That is, to test the point of view of individual candidates on matters of concern to the American public. In my opinion, there are three aspects of a presidential campaign. One, what a candidate thinks about the issues that the country is concerned about at the moment. Two, what a candidate has to say about what he would do for the country in the future, the new issues that haven't yet emerged.
And three, what makes him tick? What kind of president would he be? How would he approach the problems of the future? Does he believe in a strong staff, a strong national defense? Does he believe in the principality of the role of the chief of state? These are the things that make up a presidential campaign and make it useful to the American people. So I try to address each one of these issues, and some of them are very, very difficult, but they're the stuff that presidential campaigns are made of.
And Mr. Dole?
Well, I hadn't known we'd have gotten around to issues yet. I was hoping that would come up before the campaign ended. Whether they're single issues, all I hear is talk about momentum. I don't know that momentum's an issue, but I hear talk about little Mo and big Mo, and I don't know who's who. But whatever the issues are, I think it's time we address them. Certainly abortion, certainly gun control, certainly energy and inflation. That's a responsibility we have, and it's not too late for the people in this state to find out what we know about the issues. It would be refreshing if somebody asked me about an issue instead of a poll. It also, in my case, would be very helpful.
You're not supposed to laugh, but we can't forbid it. Mr. Reagan.
Well, there isn't much left by the time you get to the end of the line here to be said about something of this kind, except that, is it possible that those so-called single issues are an expression of a discontent on the part of the people, a feeling that the old traditional values upon which our civilization is built are fading away, that our moral standards are declining? I happen to be one who believes that
interrupting a pregnancy means taking a human life. And when I think that 1,400,000 of those lives were taken last year, legalized, and I think the people out here sense this and are hungry for a kind of spiritual revival. I think our worry about the family and the family unit and its decline is because more and more we've seen a big, intrusive government at the national level that has interfered more and more in the family itself, coming between child and parent.
Mr. Anderson?
Well, obviously, I would hope that in this campaign we would avoid single-issue politics, but three specific issues were mentioned in the question to Mr. Crane. So rather than wave our position papers around, why don't we declare what our positions are? On abortion, I am for freedom of choice. On the question of gun control, I am for the licensing of concealable hand weapons. On the question of prayer in schools, I believe that when mother sends Johnny and Susie off to the classroom in the morning, she ought to whisper in their ear and tell them, now be sure and say a prayer before you begin your school day. But I certainly don't want the state writing and composing that prayer for Johnny and Susie to recite. But I agree. These are issues that ought to be discussed and positions ought to be taken, but the overriding question has to be, where does a candidate stand really on fundamental economic issues? What is his program really for defending and securing the future of this country?
Mr. Connolly?
Mr. Smith, I've tried to talk about issues since this campaign first started. And to draw the issue clearly with the distinguished gentleman on my right, I'm against abortions, and I'm against federal funding of abortions, and I am against gun control, and I am for prayers in the school, and I am for development of energy policy in this country, including greater utilization of coal and building of more nuclear power plants. I am for doing something about inflation, and that means stopping and slowing the rate of federal spending, stop deficit spending. I am for doing something about jobs and increasing savings in this country and providing an incentive to do it and increasing productivity, of reestablishing the family units. But frankly, I don't get any questions about that from the press. I'm like Bob Dole. All I get is what poll they last saw in what a newspaper composed of 14 people that they interviewed somewhere in the country. And I'd like for the press to concern itself with some of the issues that are fundamental to this country, because we have some fundamental issues and some fundamental problems.
Governor, your time's up, I'm afraid. The next question is mine, and it's you've anticipated it, Governor Connolly. It's to Mr. Bush. It's an enduring question, and that's why I have to ask it again. The public is manifestly distressed by the failure of everything we try to do something about inflation. The guidelines don't work. The Fed's high interest rates haven't worked. Even if you cut or balance the federal budget, the Congressional Budget Office says a balanced budget would reduce inflation very little. What would you do that's not being done to succeed as well as the Japanese have in cutting inflation?
I would disagree about whether a balanced budget would not help towards breaking the back of inflation. But it's how you get in balance that counts. If you get there by shoving people into higher brackets, higher and higher tax brackets, that's not going to do it. If you get there through two other methods, it will hold the growth of spending less than the rate of inflation. That's the first thing. The second thing is you need to stimulate production, investment, risk-taking, savings by a tax cut that is not going to risk making the deficit worse, but is going to stimulate jobs in the private sector. Now, if you do those two things and couple them with some kind of regulatory relief, that means carefully drawn legislation so the regulators don't have more to say about it. That means sunset laws. That means grading federal programs, like my late friend Billy Steiger proposed. If you do those three things, we don't need to be pessimistic about the question of inflation. And you can get in balance. You can provide for the defense. The balance may take a year or two to get into it, but once you're there, if you do that and then start indexation, I believe we can do what other countries have done. We can break the back of inflation, and we can increase employment. We are pessimistic. When President Ford came into office, inflation was 12%. He vetoed legislation that broke his budget. And you know what it was when he left? 4.8%. And we are wringing our hands saying that we can't break the back of inflation. I don't believe it. I believe this investment-oriented or supply-side economics will do it. I believe if we can turn around and get more Republicans in Congress, we can do something about too much regulation. We can do it. We can solve these problems in the 80s.
Mr. Bush, that's the end of your time, I'm afraid. Mr. Baker?
Well, I think George and I disagree on two elements of his statement just now. One is the indexing of the tax rates. You know, the Constitution says that the Congress shall set the taxes, shall lay and collect taxes. I was in Brazil once a couple of years ago, and I asked them, would you do it again if you could do it over? And they said, no, because inflation feeds on itself. When you index the tax rate, the Congress ought to do that. And George didn't speak to it, but I understand he is opposed to a constitutional amendment that would make it more difficult to spend in deficit. I support an amendment that would do that. In particular, I support the Lugar Amendment. I believe that a combination of fiscal restraint by the administrative department, tax relief through the Congress, not including the indexing of tax rates, and a constitutional amendment will produce that result, and I do not think it's an impossible task.
Mr. Dole.
Well, I think the first thing, we have to go beyond the simplistic solutions that Republicans do from time to time, particularly when we're out of power. You know, somebody here may get elected, and so we better take a look at what we're going to have to do. I would say, first of all, that we don't want a value-added tax. Somebody's trying to promote that in the Congress. We do want indexing. Howard Baker is mistaken there, but he's right on a lot of things. We want to index the tax system. We also want tax credits to increase productivity. We want to restrain the growth of federal programs, not end federal programs, not cut social programs. And we need some capital formation in America. We've got to put people to work. We're going to do that through the private sector. That's the Republican side, through the private sector. And I would share the view that we need a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget.
Mr. Reagan.
Government causes inflation. Government can end inflation. I would, as my first day as president, put a freeze on the hiring of federal employees. I would then start seeking a tax reduction in the income tax rates across the board over a 3-year period to reduce them by at least 30% in an effort to create jobs. Every time unemployment goes up 1%, it costs the government $20 billion more. If you could make it go down 2%, there wouldn't be a deficit, there'd even be a surplus. I would, in addition to that, take the punitive taxes and regulations and remove them from the back of industry so that we could become more productive. And thus we wouldn't have to grind out that printing press imitation money that's destroying the value of our savings, our insurance, and our pensions. All of these things, I think, can be done, all must be done. But the president right now is suggesting an anti-inflation fight in which he is going to allow unemployment to increase $40 billion worth.
You've stopped again. Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Smith, the guidelines indeed have not worked. And one reason they haven't worked is because the ink was no sooner dry on the Dunlop Pay Advisory Board standards of 7.5% to 9.5% before you had a union come in with a 12% increase, and I heard not one word of protest from the administration about that fact. I think we've had, as the late George Meany said, merely wishboning from the administration on any guidelines. What we need is a president courageous enough not to simply leave Mr. Volcker standing there like a little Dutch boy with his finger plugging the hole in the dike and depending solely on high interest rates. And instead we ought to have a president courageous enough to deal with the kind of budget policy, fiscal policy that is going to be needed to restrain demand. You've got to have complementary budget policy, not simply rely on monetary policy alone. And then I agree with the growth measures for the economy that were recommended by Senator Dole.
Mr. Connolly.
First, I would recommend the creation of a nest egg account so that we don't tax savings. Anyone that can save up to $10,000 in this country, if they'll put it in a bank, savings loan, a common stock, or a bond, leave the income there along with the principal. They can leave it there for 5 or 10 years with no income tax on it whatsoever. All taxes would be deferred. That would generate savings in this country and capital which we desperately need. I'd recommend a change in the depreciation schedule in this country so that any new building of any kind or character for industrial or commercial purposes would bear a 10-year depreciation schedule, any equipment 5 years, any rolling stock 3 years, and any government dictated installation 1 year. I think we can cure inflation. The two principal causes are energy, government spending. I'm against the indexing of taxes. When you start indexing salaries, indexing taxes, you've given up on the fighting inflation.
Governor Connolly,
acknowledging that it's going to be with you permanently.
Mr. Crane?
First of all, you've got to define your terms. Inflation is an expansion of the money supply in excess of productivity increases. And that means it's not caused by labor, and it's not caused by business, and it's political scapegoating by Republicans and Democrats alike who try and pin that rap on either labor or business. And this means you've got to get control of the production of money. How do you do it? You've got to stop the deficits. You can either depend upon electing angels to Congress, and you can forget that one, or you can, by a constitutional limitation, bind the rascals down with the chains of the Constitution, as Jefferson recommended, or you can go back to a gold standard.